Okay, so I think we might be good to go here. So I will briefly introduce myself. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this webinar with Templeton World Charity Foundation on the topic of human flourishing. My name is Dautel. I'm the Director for Programs in Discovery Science, and I lead the Grand Challenges for Human Flourishing program. Today's webinar is the fourth and final in a series of events that will explore the distinct challenges and opportunities relating to advancing the science of human flourishing. Today's session, we will focus on how large groups of people can flourish when they disagree about what is true. Joining me today for the discussion are some recent TWCF awardees who have received initial funding to pursue research through the Grand Challenges in Human Flourishing initiative. So it's my pleasure to welcome Michael Muthukrishna, who's Associate Professor of Economic Psychology at the London School of Economics, Joceyln Dautel, who's Assistant Professor in the School of Psychology at Queen's University, Belfast, and Jing, who's Assistant Professor at the Department of Anthropology at the University of Washington. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us. I'd love to hear from each of you in just a few minutes about yourselves and your research idea that you and your colleagues are pursuing. So Michael, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Michael Muthukrishna, as you said. So I work in an area called cultural evolution, which is about human origins, why we're so different to other animals, how it is that we created this world that we live in today, what makes us different to our closest relatives. But my research idea is about how do we think about how cultural evolution is working in the 21st century. So cultural evolution emerged really about the question of human origins, but now it's kind of emerged alongside dual inheritance theory, this idea that we have both genes and culture as inheritance systems influencing our behavior, about how that emerged, so how it is that we're different. But they've emerged as this kind of theory of human behavior that applies to many of the contemporary problems that we face today. If we can understand how it is that humans have flourished through history, we might be able to say a little bit more about what might be challenges in the future to continued flourishing, and how we can ensure continued flourishing into the future. So my ideas are very much about thinking about cultural evolution in the age of the internet, in the age of much greater diversity, in the age of competition over resources, in the age of a climate change world.
Awesome, thanks, Michael. Joceyln, would you like to go next?
Sure. So I am Joceyln Dautel, and as Stuart said, I'm an assistant professor in the School of Psychology at Queen's University in Northern Ireland. And I am a developmental psychologist, and my interests lie in how young people navigate their social worlds, and I'm especially interested in how they do so in areas of intergroup conflict. So I conduct cross-cultural research on when and how children learn conflict-related categories, and especially in these contexts that have these historic dichotomous social divides that are related to polarized cultural or national and or political beliefs. So that's what brought me to this Grand Challenges in Human Flourishing initiative. And so I'm really interested in the processes that will ultimately bridge these divides across children and people in these contexts and promote peace that contribute to human flourishing. So our study idea, our project idea for this call stems from a collaboration amongst Jing and I, who will introduce herself in just a minute, and 6 other interdisciplinary scholars whose research ranges from developmental psychology to neuroscience to cultural evolution like Michael, and anthropology. And so when we were thinking about this, we were thinking that one way in which we feel human flourishing can be promoted is by empowering what we call epistemic vigilance, or in other words, empowering people to seek truth, but at the same time, empowering them to do so by being cognizant of where information is coming from and critical of the sources of their information and the evidence in support and against of information. And so this is especially important today where information and of course misinformation are so abundant and so easily accessible through technology and social media. So when we were thinking about our idea, we focused on two critical points. So one is that we think it's critically important to investigate how truth is produced and consumed across dynamic levels of societies. So for instance, when we think about truth, we can think about all sorts of influences on that truth, like macro level influences from cultural and political narratives, meso level influences from communities that people live in and the schools that they go to, more micro level influences from transmission through families and peers. And these all influence the way that information can be produced and consumed by individuals. And the other direction that we're coming from is a developmental perspective. So we're interested in investigating how information consumption and production might change across the lifespan. So the reason is that studying the conditions under which children are more or less willing to evaluate information might also inform conditions under which adults' beliefs might be more or less entrenched. So we can gain some insight into human nature that way. We can also think about different periods of development that might inform mechanisms for belief revision. So for example, there's periods in the lifespan where young people might be more willing to revise what they've previously held as fundamental truths. And we're interested in why this is the case. So overall, we're hoping to study how humans seek truth across societies, across interactive levels within societies, and across the lifespan. And we're hoping that by doing so, we can inform interventions that might create more knowledgeable and resilient societies and in turn promote human flourishing. So that's the broad idea. We're going to start a bit smaller by thinking about how young people in Northern Ireland consume and transmit information within and between groups. So in this polarized society that I'm in here in Belfast, we're going to start doing an experimental study using the age-old game of telephone, or what some people in the UK sometimes call Chinese whispers. And so the game is I hear a message first, and then I tell that message to another person who tells another person, and so on. And so it's always interesting to see, and that's the fun of the game, is to see how the message changes after cumulative recall. So in this case, we're going to experimentally manipulate whether young people are hearing and transmitting messages between members of their own social group, alternatively between mixed group chains. So for example, in Northern Ireland, a Catholic young person might speak to a Protestant who might speak to another Catholic, for example. And we're really interested in whether the diversity of a chain of transmission might diffuse the polarization of the information that's being transmitted. And so this is one way that we're hoping to begin thinking about how exposure to diversity might influence how we as individuals and how young people take in information. And so I'll turn it over to Jing to expand on our thinking.
Right. Thank you, Joceyln. And my name is Jing Xu. I am an anthropologist and a China specialist. It's a great time to be a China specialist in the US. But on the bright side, I study child development. So I was also trained in developmental psychology, especially on social cognition and pro-social development in early childhood. So the central question I am interested in is how do we become moral persons, to think of our future and hope and morality, or what kind of values we believe in, what kind of stories we tell ourselves to aspire to become is very important linked to truth and to human flourishing. And look at child development specifically through ethnographic fieldwork by looking at child development in naturalistic contexts, school, in family and communal settings. And I'm also interested in tying the kind of a micro and meso levels to the larger historical and cultural processes. As Michael mentioned, cultural evolution, being a China specialist, the Chinese culture and how it evolves and how the long-term effects on everyday life even today, and on child development and on education and political ideology is all really connected and related. And in this specific project that Joceyln is our leader, I'm really happy to be part of it. I am kind of approaching how children acquire beliefs and revise their beliefs by looking at the cultural historical part, specifically by looking at the kind of narratives they are exposed to, especially in a polarized society, Northern Ireland, or where I'm living in the United States, or even looking at my own experience growing up in a place like China, and then have to revise my own beliefs and kind of recalibrate what kind of narratives and truths I believe in, and to see what's been going on in the US. It is really an important time for us to talk about these issues. And I think child development is a wonderful perspective to look at.
That's amazing. Thanks, thanks, Joceyln. Thanks, Jing. Michael, I realize I cut you off a bit early there. What right. I really want to, what I think, and this is sort of a good segue as well. A lot of what's been mentioned is on this concept of truth, and a lot of the time when people talk about truth, it's sort of, oh well, is it in the textbook? If it isn't, maybe it's true, and if it's not in the textbook, oh, it's probably not true. We have these intuitive definitions of what we think is true, but we're realizing that's not always the case. So can you tell us a bit more about sort of how this concept of truth applies to cultural evolution today? I think that would be really great.
Yeah, so one of the in my proposal, which you can find online, I laid out a series of questions and areas that I think cultural evolution might have a different answer to the way that we normally think about these things. And one of them is truth and how that interacts with our global communication network, the internet, social media, and so on. So from a cultural evolutionary perspective, there are some things that we have direct access to in terms of truth, things that come about from our direct experience. You touch a hot stove, you get burned, you discover that hot things burn. You might eat a sweet item and think, apples are generally sweet, of course, except when they're not. But for most of what we truly believe as being absolutely 100% true, we acquire these things from the people around us. We acquire them socially. From the time that we're children, from the people that we think are the smartest, from the people that we think know the most, and from what most people think. To the point where we have what psychologists call an illusion of explanatory depth. So we interact with the world in a way that we assume that we kind of understand how things work, and we know why it is that we do the things we do. Like, why do you brush your teeth, Dawood?
I like to think I brush my teeth, yes.
Do you do it once or twice a day, or
twice, but my wife will tell you I probably don't do it as thoroughly as I should.
But why do you do that?
Well, I'm told it keeps my teeth clean.
Because I'm worried about plaque or something, or
Yeah, I feel it's a trick question now. I feel like maybe all of that is a lie, and it's
no. So I mean,
yes, absolutely.
We have these beliefs, right? That in these classic experiments, you ask people, how does a flushing toilet work? And people are like, yeah, I kind of get that. Water goes, But then you ask people, well, how does it flush everything away and kind of return to the same point? This is a centuries-old technology that we interact with regularly. Fingers crossed. But they have no idea. It's like, it's like, well, I don't know. And it's the same for, why do you brush your teeth? Because of plaque. What's plaque? The thing that grows on teeth. How often do you really need to brush it? Well, I mean, it turns out if you did it really well, probably once every 2 days, but you don't do it well, so you do it twice a day. But you never look this stuff up. That's not how, you believe these things because the smartest people. And sometimes you believe these things in violation of your everyday experience. Like if I came here and said, guys, I got to tell you, the world is flat and there's a sun, you would go like, oh, that's weird. Templeton's funding some interesting research these days. I'm not here to convince you of that, but that is what your everyday experience is, right? Like a flat earth with a sun tracing the sky from east to west. But you will swear up and down that we live on a spheroid rotating around a star, one of many stars in the Milky Way, one of many galaxies in the universe. And the reason you believe that, and the reason you believe that, there's a virus causing COVID, and there's a reason you believe that it's germs that make us sick and not spirits, is because the smartest people around you, most people around you, believe that. They act in ways that are consistent. So, the way Joceyln, Jing mentioned it, epistemic vigilance. People wouldn't be washing their hands so frequently. They wouldn't be wearing masks. They wouldn't be avoiding these things if they didn't believe these things. So what happens if so much of our knowledge is vicariously acquired? It means that the transmission lines that get to us, like how we decide what it is that most people believe, are taintable in a world that is something like the internet. Like I can't just survey everyone around me. I'm kind of getting it from, what's in my Twitter feed, what's in my Facebook, what's in the Facebook comments. And so you can poison that well. But I think cultural evolution also has things to say about how it is that we discern when people are lying to us. So when language evolved, it was an incredible way to transmit information. I mean, imagine if I was doing this without language, right? But language also allows you to lie. And so evolution gives us things that like sincerity displays or credibility enhancing displays, where we look to see if someone has an incentive to be lying to us, or if their behavior would be costly if they were lying to you. We don't get that information online. You can distinguish if that is a real person, how long they've had the account, whether what else they have said, whether there's any reputation on the line. All of that's hidden because we're not thinking about it in this kind of way. So that's the first side of it. The second side of it is that humans do two things. We compete with one another, and we cooperate with one another, and we cooperate to compete with one another. Our greatest achievements and our worst atrocities are both cooperative acts. Like we never do this alone. Even though we have a psychology that points to people. It's like that politician was responsible for this. That person was responsible for the invention, but that's not really what's driving these things. Again, in the modern world, problems that were never problems because we didn't have a large enough population for someone with values that were different to reach a critical mass. And in any case, they couldn't find each other because they were isolated. Now they can through the internet. How do we resolve that?
Cool. Yeah, and I think this is a really good starting place to talk about some of the big challenges that we face. There are lots of amazing things about using the internet and our ability to communicate messages at much lower cost, much more easily. It's great, especially for us who are working in scientific research. It's great to be able to share data, share information with one another. But I think this may be a good place to start exploring some of the complexities of our social interactions, because as you mentioned, we're now faced with increasing volumes of polarizing information. It's not all neutral information. And alongside of that, we're dealing with things like global public health crisis and rising inequality. And these things can interfere with our capacity to flourish. At the foundation, we sort of think of some of these challenges as opportunities to flourish. So John Templeton had a saying that trouble is opportunity. Sort of thought optimistically about turning challenges into opportunities for success. So we take that positive approach, but we're realistic about some of the big challenges here, including this issue about how large groups of people can make the best decision together, especially if some of the people in the groups disagree, and the outcome is predictable. So let's dig into some of these with some more questions. I think at this stage, if anybody in the audience has a question, please use our Q&A feature. We have a questions and answer feature. We will also monitor the chat, but maybe not as often. So please pop questions in the Q&A. You can do that at any time. I'm going to start off with some questions, but please add your questions at any time for the panel, and we will discuss those. So let's maybe start here at the as sort of a general comment. Do either of you have general thoughts on how we should address this this challenge, or perhaps on whether we should assume that truth is objective to begin with, or sort of what is truth? And I don't know, Joceyln, maybe you'd like to start us off with that, because I know you've been doing a lot of thinking in that area.
Sure, yep. So Out of interest, I actually have looked up the dictionary definition of truth just to see, you know, what are we supposed to think truth is, and it says truth is what is in accordance with fact or reality. So I think this is really important because in that sense, truth sounds quite objective and dichotomous, right? It's true or it's not true. It matches reality or it doesn't. But then you begin to think, and especially get into you know, other disciplines like philosophy, what is real? And I think what's important here is that our realities can differ based on any number of factors. And this is really what we're excited about studying. So our group has discussed one way of thinking about truth as not necessarily dichotomous, right or wrong, truth or not truth, but perhaps as more of a continuum from not true to true. And so, for instance, whether something is green or yellow, or when it changes from green to yellow, can vary across individuals, can vary based on the lighting that you're in. It can vary on any number of factors. And so most of us, as Michael was saying, would be more likely to agree that a color is green if a consensus of others first called it green. And in some cases, people might be saying it's green to agree with this consensus and not stand out. However, other times, people might actually truly revise their belief in line with others' beliefs that the color is green and not yellow. And exactly where that falls on that spectrum could be arbitrary based on all of these factors. And so perhaps it's not truth or not truth, but maybe somewhere along a continuum. So I'd be interested to hear what the others think.
I mean,
Yeah, does anyone else have thoughts on that?
Do you want to jump in, Jing, or?
Yeah, I can add, just also inspired by Michael's comments earlier. I've been thinking, since we're also talking about group level, right, communities, and truth can be so intimately connected to our identity, group identity, especially in kind of a coalitional dynamics, as Michael said, when groups are kind of competing for some scarce resource, it can get really messy. So what I'm saying is, in certain domains or in certain contexts, or when you're facing maybe a more uncertain future, things can be more, what it means by truth can be more contested than in other domains or in some other contexts, because it's just so tied to our identity, and it's sometimes so kind of harnesses strong human emotions to the extent that we are kind of blinded by our own ignorance and our kind of emotional or other kind of commitments. So Northern Ireland or UK and the US right now, and in the past few years, we can clearly see, for example, in the political domain, it can be very, very debated what it even means by truth, or how different groups really approach the definition and how they see as truth, how they judge. So this is opens up a lot of interesting opportunities for research and conversations.
Yeah, I think that's right, Jing. So I guess, one of the points of my little rant about toothbrushes and toilets was that, there's a difference between what we have access to as truth, like what we believe to be truth, and the kind of population level process that is filtering truth for us. And that links to, one of the questions that I just saw in the Q&A about this predictive power. So truth is stuff that has worked, that is adaptive over time. The things that, and they don't always have to be actually true. Like there may be myths that are just highly adaptive to hold. Like we hold these truths to be self-evident. First off, you wouldn't say if it was self-evident if it really were self-evident, that all men are created equal. It's like, okay, well, I mean, when we look around, it doesn't seem like all people are equal. It's not self-evident at all. So what does that really mean? But that's a very useful truth to have, or at least it's a useful truth to kind of to coalesce around. And then to Jing's point, often, what we consider truth is very much connected to our identity, especially when it doesn't actually impact our lives. So metaphysical commitments, like we hold these truths to be self-evident, but also, like in my field, evolution. I can not believe in evolution, but then go on benefiting from all that evolutionary biology and medicine have managed to achieve based on those principles, because it's costless. All that matters is, what does my group believe in that particular case.
Yeah, I think.
Sorry, go ahead, Joceyln.
I was just going to say, I think, we talk about modern technology and seeing only the information that's presented to us and biasing our truths that way. But I think it's important to think that most of the things that we've learned, we have to remember, whether we learn them in school or any other way, we have to remember that at the bottom of that is usually a person, and that person is an individual who's been raised in a particular culture with a particular political narrative, educated themselves by a particular teacher, and probably influenced by family and peers who hold certain beliefs themselves. And so I think that's something that's really important to recognize, and even perhaps that's a way that we need to get people to understand that that's the way that their beliefs are formed, and think about how that then influences their own realities.
And on this concept of different kinds of truth, we have a question from one of our attendees on the concept of spirituality and human flourishing. And I'd love to know if any of you have any answers, either on whether this is being researched, sort of spirituality in the area of human flourishing. It's something the foundation is definitely has some interest in, but I'd love to hear from you, and also how spirituality comes into this concept of truth.
I mean, there's definitely research being done on the role of religion, both in terms of binding us in cooperative groups. So as a way, so sometimes, I call it a super ethnic identity. So we think, earlier I said that, we cooperate and we compete. Religions allow us to cooperate at a scale that is higher than our ethnicities. We can bind together on common beliefs. And there is also work on, the role that spiritual beliefs play in our well-being and so on. In the sense of, truth being adaptive, then many of these things can be highly adaptive. There's a point that Joceyln made just before that, that seems worth following up on in terms of different groups and, and having like a narrow world experience, or like, we are creatures of a particular time and place, depending on our birth cohort and where we lived and our socioeconomic status and all of that. And that creates, all kinds of problems of diversity. We are more weaved together and connected than we have ever. I mean, things like even something like migration is a constant feature of the human story, but not in the way today, right? Like where you have very culturally distant peoples living together for the most part, side by side, cooperating and collaborating. And the countries of their origins are also trying to work together on global issues that face us all. But sometimes, I think Jing made this point in some of our pre-discussions, culture's like the water that we're in, and we don't notice it till the water changes or you're somewhere else. There are these kind of underlying assumptions about what is true and what is correct and how people should behave that are not universal, but we never think about it because we don't meet people who don't share that. One of my favorite examples is that not everyone wants freedom. Most people just want to survive. They want food for their families, and they want safety for their kids and a good life for the next generation. Freedom, I mean, it's on the list, but it's not super high until those are met. And even so, they might want order over freedom. And when we don't share those assumptions, we don't see that. And the only way around that is to talk to one another. I feel like I want to say a little more of that, but maybe Joceyln and Jing want to come in.
Jing, it seems like this is something your experience speaks quite close to.
Yeah, I want to just tell an anecdote with following up on Michael's comment. I have a friend in China, and she's living in the US, and her mom once got a scam call. In China, I'm here to get scam calls all the time. And her mom was like very frustrated. But then 1 second later, she is living in Beijing. The policeman knocked on her door, and then helped her deal with the situation. And when my friend kind of intuitive reaction, she's been living and studying in the US for a long time. She has a different worldview from her mom's generation. So do I. And her initial reaction was like, that is terrible. You're being kind of under surveillance 24/7. And the government, whatever please, knows clearly what your phone is doing. But her mom feels so happy because she felt safe. She felt like she was being protected. So this is just one anecdote to kind of remind us that we really live in and live by committing to certain basic principles that might differ from some other people in another part of the world, or even just from your neighbor, or even from someone in your family. And I would want to add to that I believe narratives are a very big part of that we are kind of soaked in, we are I wouldn't say brainwashed, even though these days people like to use that term, but I think that really obscures the whole process, complicated dynamics of psychology and the environment. But the point is we are kind of our identity, what we believe in, is mediated by these narratives. I think in the humanities, there is an important concept called the dichotomy between propositional truth and narrative truth. So let's say we can agree on certain truths that something did happen, some event like Pearl Harbor attack. It did happen in history. We can all agree on that. How do we reach that agreement is another story, but we agree on that. But then how to really make sense of that? We really tell different stories about the same exact historical event. And in terms of really nailing down to what we call narrative truth, it is a very controversial story. And we hold on to those. We don't believe that the other party or people who disagree with us really have any sort of rationality in believing a different version of story. And those can really, those underneath those are very deep kind of a narrative schemas or structures that we are not really consciously reflecting on in our everyday life, just because it's really an important part of what we tell who we are. Yeah. So I went on that, and we can talk about that more later if needed.
There's a great book called The Invention of Tradition, which goes through, like Scottish traditions or African American traditions and all these things, and how they actually don't go all that far back, but they allow people to kind of unify under a common banner. It's like, we have these traditions that go so far back, and they're not that old at all. They were invented at some point. Yeah.
Wow, that's I think that that's one of those surprising facts that we assume to be true, but turns out not to be. But just before we move on from this topic on freedom, we have a question from one of our attendees about why some people might not want to have freedom, and whether it's a matter of freedom not being important to them, or whether it's a matter of other basic needs being fulfilled for which they're willing to sacrifice freedom to get those. And I don't know if Michael or someone else wants to comment on that.
I mean, I guess the question is, you're almost asking like, why should people share my cultural values? I mean, you'd have to come up with an a priori good theory for why an animal or humans would want freedom intrinsically. Otherwise, it's kind of one of those cultural values that has kind of emerged and might be useful in many contexts. I mean, freedom is useful, right? Freedom of inquiry, freedom of speech allows us to discover truths because reality is difficult, and we don't know if we've got it right, especially when it's so much of it is vicarious and based on how much we trust one another. So yeah, I mean, I think people can want truth, but I'm not sure that it is this universal. I mean, you don't have to go culturally that far. I've been fascinated. I lived for over a decade in Australia, and I'm fascinated watching Canadians and Americans in particular looking at how Australia has dealt with this pandemic and zero COVID. And they're like, oh my God, Australia is turning into like a fascist state. How is this possible? But for Australians, it's not surprising. I mean, not everyone agrees with it, but it's certainly not surprising. Australia has like this cultural history of both being the convicts and the people making sure the convicts were well behaved. It has this duality. The larrikin's like, oh, you got me that time, but maybe next time I'll get away from it. And so that kind of authoritarianism is not uncommon. Like speed limits are really enforced. cops are waiting behind bushes to kind of get you. It's not like Australians don't want freedom. It's just that it doesn't have this this valorization that it has, particularly in the United States. Now, that's not to say it's not useful. I think the freedom is incredibly useful, and I think freedom of speech is essential. There are two great pieces that I think kind of speak to this. One is this lovely model and evidence from this economist Moti Mikali, where he looks at like freedom of speech and the tendency to kind of squash dissent and how it can actually lead to polarization. The idea being that if you allow people to kind of speak freely, but only kind of punish like truly extreme speech, then people kind of move toward the center because, that's fine. But if you squash even like minor deviations from the correct behavior, then people are like, well, I believe this other thing, in for a penny, in for a pound. I'm just going to, squash that. And you get this kind of almost like cultural speciation taking place. And the other line of evidence is that like on emotional expression. So when people have had a long run history of migration where they are forced to live side by side and communicate with one another, they find ways to be more explicit about there. So Americans are known for like their big smiles. The contrast is often Japanese, where they don't necessarily emote so clearly. You don't need to. Every other Japanese person knows exactly what someone would feel in that context because there's a shared culture. But if you have multiple people living in a diverse society, you don't know what your neighbor is saying. They might speak a different language, but you got to be clear when you're angry, when you're happy, and clear when you're sad, and clear when you're angry. And so that's what's kind of, I think, starting to break down in our society today. To the degree that we are not talking to each other, the degree that we are segregated in any way, it's a failure of freedom, and it's a failure to kind of come to common truths that can only emerge through that kind of discussion.
Well, I think this ties in nicely to another question that we received on, what are the young kids doing these days? We're kind of millennials are getting older, and we've got even earlier generations going online. And we have a question about this idea that that some people in the younger generation are currently self-organizing into migrant communities that are characterized by more optimal levels of connectivity, transparency, that might help promote diversity and transmitting truth. So I wonder whether there are any thoughts on this, but also whether any of you know about research in this area.
I mean, I can speak to it, but maybe Joceyln or Jing might want to go first. I don't want to dominate.
I don't know of any research in particular. However, we do have, I wish a member of our group was here at the minute, Jennifer Neal is really interested in, and Mariah Kornblow as well, on looking at this and looking at young people's social networks, and especially looking at what makes people, young people, more interested to connect with each other, and what circumstances are they more willing to share information, and using newer methods of social network analysis. And so that's something that we're really interested in looking at down the road, and especially how is this functioning online, right? When people are really choosing in real time, I'm going to share this information to this person, but not this person. Well, why is that? And how can we trace that information?
Yeah, I wanted to add that the network perspective is a really, really interesting approach. And one of the things is it's complicated. It's not that because people are connecting to each other is naturally lead to a brighter future. And I think so, because in network analysis, there's a lot of evidence pointing to homophily, or assortivity, right? People of birds of the same feather, they flock together. So people with similar interest or a similar background, they tend to network together. They tend to kind of based on similarity rather than difference. And there might be kind of difference-based networks, but more status difference. So kind of people seeking to, even young children, I saw some research about friendship networks in Chinese schools. They kind of want to establish connections with the higher status students or individuals, which also makes sense. But so there's a lot of intricate complexity in there that awaits us to kind of research more. But I do want to echo Joceyln on the network approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of those super important questions that we are still coming to terms with, what the internet and social media are doing to our societies. cooperation and competition, as I said, are two sides of the same coin. The internet allows us to form critical masses of people through these communities that would never have been able to find each other in the past. I mean, think of the LGBT community. You'd be isolated. You wouldn't know who shared this. But through online platforms, you can find one another. Anyone with any obscure interest can find another person with that obscure interest and form a community and begin to perhaps advocate for that. And that might be because you're really into some strange form of, some board game, but it might also be because you're into QAnon. And we're not, we're still coming to terms with that, because what you're really doing is creating separate cultural groups that are now able to compete with one another. The ability to move between cultural groups empowers this kind of cultural evolutionary process. So there's this work by Patrick Francois, where they look at, so companies, for example, are an example of cultural groups that people can freely move between for the most part. And they learn from one another, they share, they copy successful strategies. And as a result of that, they evolve, they become more adaptive over time, and people can, with their labor, decide where they want to go. And so places with stronger competition actually have more trust within those companies than when there's less competition between those firms, right? So now you have this competition online between groups with very different interests and very different commitments. And as I said, I don't, this is one of the things that I propose, because I don't think we have a straight answer for that yet. And it's a super important question to answer. I think it's a net good on the whole, but I just think that, I'm not sure.
So just following up from this with another question from our attendees on if we think about big challenges and how young people might learn to face the world, or face those challenges in the world online. Do we have any thoughts on sort of the positive side of that? How that could be done? What data would one have to consider, or how that might differ between generations?
I think that this is a really interesting question, because we're seeing a phenomenon now, especially related to climate change, where young people are taking the lead in trying to change their world. It's really meaningful to them. This is their future, and they want to make sure that they have a future. And so we see people like Greta Thunberg popping up and really making a difference. And we can think about different ways of social learning. So how we learn from each other and how we learn from across generations and across peers. And so in our field, we talk about this as different types of transmission. So horizontal transmission would be peer-to-peer learning, or horizontal transmission could either be young people learning from older people. But what's really interesting here is thinking about how older people are going to begin learning from younger people. And is this a trend that we might be seeing more for some of these big questions? Especially, we can also think about young people and their technical abilities, which are often, their connections are going to be stronger than people from other generations.
Yeah, I want to add that, first of all, I'm a mother of an 11-year-old. We live in Seattle, a very liberal, progressive area. My son, he wrote something in his school workbook, like, I think we're doomed. Like, our previous generation kind of created disaster on the planet, and we need to say, he is very conscious about that. And I think a large part is because he lived in this particular area of the US, that there's so much talk in schools, in the family and elsewhere about climate change. But I can imagine as well in some other part of the world, even in some other part of this country, some younger kids, my son's age, are into completely different agendas or different causes, or don't really believe in climate change. And what do we do with that? And I think studying some critical phases in human development is really important. I'm thinking of, for example, early to full-blown adolescence. I was just reading an article on the New Yorker about the Beatles. It occurred to me, some young kids changed the world, right? They kind of invented youth culture. And part of it because in that phase of human development, it's not entirely universal in the uniform manner, but most likely they are the ones that are most confused about life in that stage, and they are the ones who ask big questions and kind of are more involved in proposing ideas and thinking out of the box. So maybe we can look at more research on that child development and adolescence phase. So it's very important, and I'm curious to find out more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both of that. Like from a cultural evolutionary perspective, a child is born and has to catch up with the last several thousand years of human history, and they do that with these kind of social learning biases that Joceyln, alluded to. They are trying to figure out who's got the knowledge that's adaptive, who is successful, who is prestigious. What do most people believe? What is the right thing to believe? Who's sincere about it? All of these things, right? And so depending on what signals they're getting about that, they absorb these ideas in a way that we are already kind of fixed. We are presenting the array of possibilities to them, and they're deciding who is correct here. It's like Planck's principle, like science moves forward one funeral at a time, and progress moves forward as the kids learn who was right in the previous generation, hopefully.
So we've got a few more questions in the Q&A. I think if anybody else has questions, please pop them in the Q&A now so we can sort of time the discussion. Well, I'm gonna start with a question that just quickly comes back to this concept of truth. I think we've touched on it a little bit. But just so we don't forget about it, because this is a really important concept, and it's about this idea of objective truth. We've had great discussions about some of the nuances around truth, and things that we think are true are not necessarily true. But just as one of our attendees asked, and I think it's a very important fundamental question, can we agree on some fundamental truths, and is there a way to really understand those? And I think I'll hand that to Jing as it's your area.
Thank you. It's a tough question, but it's really worth thinking and debating about. I think my hunch is there's really no absolute. I mean, I believe there are fundamental truths, but not a singular truth. Why do I believe in that? Back to my own area, studying morality, and Michael and Joceyln, you both know of the theories about the origins of morality and human cooperation. There are evolutionarily or cross-culturally, there are just, I think, the fundamental truths we believe in, or the kind of moral values we hold on to as an entire group of humanity, it is pluralistic to begin with. Not to say that there's no universal aspect to it. Every society has some values regarding how to treat your family members, or how to cooperate, how to reciprocate. But then there are also other concerns. And that's why when another question was about freedom, how can anybody not believe in freedom? And that's the problem. Freedom is important, or some other values are important. There are fundamental truths, but they're multiple, right? It's a multiplicity of truths, because humans are faced with a multitude of problems to solve, from evolutionary past to today. So sometimes, in many times actually, especially in fast changing times, and now like what we are living in now, there are just conflicts arising between, you have to solve problems across different domains. I have a Chinese idiom that we got to know since childhood. It's been transmitted across history. So it's called 大义灭亲. It's called you have to kill your kin to fulfill your duty as a subject to your king. So there's kind of two conflicting moral commands, right? And that has been going on. It's not unique to China. I believe it's quite universal across all the societies, because you have this commitment, obligation, and fitness benefits related to your kin, but also you have, in certain hierarchical societies or communities, you also have to consider that primate societies are very hierarchical, for example, right? Some primate species. In human society, I think more and more evolutionary anthropology research has pointed to the early origins of hierarchy too. So that's just one example to say that we have truth, we have multiple truths, and sometimes they come into conflict. And I think it's important for us to step back and realize that. And as researchers to then kind of also realize that and then probe further and see how we can come to some sort of a self-awareness. I think that is the very first step.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Jing. And one thing that I would add is you talked about competing truths, which is absolutely true. But sometimes people can hold simultaneous truths that aren't competing. In psychology and anthropology, some of our colleagues have done some work thinking about a coexistence hypothesis, or how can two seemingly competing beliefs that might explain a phenomenon coexist in a mind. So this often is studied in the areas of religion and science, for example. So as humans, we're always seeking to be able to explain these phenomena around us, but we might hold, a scientific or a biological piece of evidence that supports why something happens, but we also might simultaneously have a religious explanation for why something happens. And sometimes those can contradict, and in some cultures, science and religious values are more likely to contradict. So for example, some research done by Kathleen Corvo, one of our colleagues, has found that in the US and Iran, or US and China, for example, science values and religious values tend to contradict, or at least be negatively related. So the more you believe in one, the less you believe or value the other. But in other contexts where science and religion are more holistically incorporated into worldviews, like Iran, that's not the case. So in Iran, surveys of people have found that religious beliefs aren't negatively correlated to scientific beliefs. So you can hold scientific beliefs and also still have a religious explanation for that phenomenon.
Yeah. I think it's a little bit the way biologists talk about ultimate and proximate explanations. Like if you have a framework for incorporating these different levels of explanation, then they don't necessarily have to be in conflict. So you might say, okay, well, this is, why do animals like sweet things? Because, it fires off the neurochemicals, but at an ultimate level, it's because, they need calories. But then you might say at a super ultimate level, why is any of this? Well, I could insert a religious framework over that. I'd like to take Sarah's question actually on increased global interconnectivity. I mean, I suspect it is. So I'm not too worried about diversity, because there's plenty of creation of diversity through recombination or, separate incentives or all kinds of things like that. But I do think that our shared media culture, anyone else watching Squid Games, our shared media culture, our shared the fact that we see news from other places, and the more of that there is, it will help bring us to a common page, or at least find where we should be arguing. In some research that's not yet published, we use the new cultural distance tool, and what we do find is that if among people who are educated, the kind of ordering of cultural distances between countries is preserved, but they're much smaller. So in other words, just by virtue of, like, you might be from a different country, but by virtue of having a higher education, we already have something in common. We already have a common framework, because education is this major deliverer of a cultural package, right? Reading, writing, arithmetic, reason, and so on. Yeah.
Right. This is these are really amazing responses. Thank you. I think there's one more question left in the Q&A. So I think we should have a go at answering that one, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time and try and finish as close to the hour as possible. So I don't know, presumably everybody can see this, but I might just read it off as well. It's on this topic of thinking of morals as theories of how a group can behave to maximize a set of values. And the question is whether that implies that moral systems can be incorrect, in that they do not bring about the desired values in practice. So I'd love to know whether anybody has thoughts on that.
I mean, I'm not sure if I've understood the question. Yeah. But I mean, yes, I think, I mean, if we assume that moral values are about, maximizing some group attributes, like the theory of, the cultural evolution of religion, that it's not an accident that religions are pro-social, they're pro-fertility. These are things that have helped those groups grow. Any major world religion today has these features that allow them to bind together into large cooperative groups. But at the same time, major world religions today have different moral values. Around duty and forgiveness and also metaphysical values, and they will probably have different outcomes. And there's a competition for believers, and there's a competition for, interaction with the secular state that's going on. But I don't know if I fully understood the question.
Sure, and I didn't know if the person who asked the question wants to sort of clarify there. But in the meantime, we might quickly move on to a question for Jing and others on how we can better advocate for more understanding of broader epistemologies if the dominant narrative is trying to play off Western values as the objective truth.
That is a great question. Something I've been grappling for a long time, finding, myself to. I think I've benefited greatly from talking to and reading the work of one of my graduate mentors, James Wirch. He has a new book called How Nations Remember. He studies collective memory identity and how narratives are part of that. And he helped me really understand, okay, the US, what is the meta narrative of one of the meta narratives of the US? For example, shining light upon a city on the hill, right? It's kind of a broadcasting, liberating the oppressed people in the world, and kind of broadcasting liberty and freedom, all that to the world, which has religious basis, for example. But when I grew up, the narrative was so different, and the values were very different. And I come to realize what I had come to believe in, and then had suspicion about, and then kind of recalibrate it. For example, in China, it's always talking about the country as the center of the world, Middle Kingdom, from millennia, thousands of years ago, and now we're rejuvenating through the leadership of whatever president. So it's really, there are the very different meta narratives that are shaped by, and also shaping history of a long term. I think that's the first step for me, at least. I come to realize the kind of narratives I was exposed to and hold on to, and see how another group might differ from me. And I think having the consciousness and then engaging in some sort of open conversations is actually really needed and helpful. And I'm sure other people have insights.
Well, I'm afraid we have run out of time, but I'll give you each 20 seconds if you'd like to respond.
I was just going to say, I agree, Jing. I think it's exactly what you said. It's, perhaps encouraging travel, encouraging people to see diverse perspectives is a really good first step.
I think we're very much on the same page. The greatest thing about diversity is that we get to pick what works, pick what's best. And so we get to see it. And so, yeah, just exposing yourself to people you disagree with and different ideas is the best way to do that.
Good. Well, thanks again, Joceyln, Michael, and Jing. And thanks to all of our attendees for joining us today. This has really been a great discussion. For those interested in the recording, it will be on YouTube in a couple of weeks. So please join our mailing list to find out when this happens and to learn about our future events. We will plan to continue the conversation on this topic. The Foundation hopes to launch new initiatives and opportunities next year. So please stay in touch. And with that, I'll just say thanks again, everyone. Thanks, Michael, Joceyln, and Jing for joining us. And thanks to all our attendees.
Good chatting, guys. See you later. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good to see you all. Bye.
Good.